Okay, it should be going live very soon. Great. So we're live. Namaste, Sahana ji. Thank you so much for joining HSC for our second Charcha Chat episode. Welcome again to everyone on our platform. So Sahana ji is currently Director of Indian History Awareness and Research. And Sahana ji, to begin the episode, I'd like to just get you to explain a little bit about the work that IHAR does and why you feel it's important, especially for the Hindu American youth who are growing up here in the US. So I'll let you take that part away.
Yeah, namaste to everyone. It's a privilege to speak to the next generation of Hindus who are so interested in Indian history and culture. So I represent IHAR, Indian History Awareness and Research, which is a think tank based in Houston. And we are digging out narratives of Indian history, which have been largely ignored by mainstream scholars. And we are looking at history from the Indic perspective. And also we are looking at it from the, from the sources, Indic sources of literature, history, and so as you know, we have, India has been ruled by different people, and it has been invaded, it has been colonized, and a lot of our history has not been written by us. So our think tank tries to correct that, and we are looking at history with a fresh perspective, and we are looking at it with a multidisciplinary approach, so with a big vision. So we are engineers, physicians, media persons, all people from different backgrounds, so that we all approach history with, from different viewpoints. So it's not just humanities people who are looking at history as it used to be before. So, and we are also applying very rigorous science to what we are studying, what we are looking at. So that's what IHAR does. And so we have been doing workshops, delivering talks, writing books, and we are also planning a conference on Indic chronology very soon in India in a couple of months. Maybe I can talk about that later.
Awesome. Yeah, we'd love to hear about that. So on today's episode, we're going to be discussing specifically the history of India's educational systems and its educational heritage. Right. So you've written a book, The Educational Heritage of Ancient India, How an Ecosystem of Learning Was Laid to Waste. Yes. Can you first explain why, there it is.
Yeah.
So can you first, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, go on. What's your question?
So I was going to ask you, can you explain why you felt the need to focus on the history of India's educational systems and its institutions, and what actually is the history of them?
Okay. So, so I often get asked, why are Indians so focused on education, on getting degrees, on higher education? But even you, as growing up in the US, you might have noticed how Indian parents tend to put a lot of pressure on their children to study hard, to do well, right? So on grades, on getting all those degrees. So, so I was interested to know why we are this way, that we are so focused on education. And of course, there were other experiences. When I moved to the US, I found that the textbooks the history textbooks that my daughter was using was not representing Indian history correctly. It was too negative. It was just talking about the caste systems, the gender inequality in India and such things. So I felt that was just I couldn't identify with what they wrote about Indians. In order to explain that better, I had to do my own research. So that's how I started reading a lot of books, and I found that there's so much information out there that people are not paying attention to, and it's only in the academic world. So I felt that there's a need to write a book in a simpler language, bringing all those various narratives together. So that's when I started doing this. So I wrote a series of articles on education in ancient India, and then that finally became a book.
Very nice. And so today we also wanted to focus, of course, on what exactly the nature of these institutions were. So can you explain briefly how the educational institutions in India and the way that epistemology and learning worked in ancient India is different from how it works both in India and in the US today? What was unique and what were the unique contributions of that system?
Okay. So if you want, I can just speak for about 10 minutes just on what's in my book, and that'll answer all those things that you're asking.
Of course.
Okay. So, so today we live in a world where we take for granted that we go to school and then we go to college, we specialize in a subject of our choice. And all this is so institutionalized, but many of us don't know that this comes from the Indian civilization, which is where it all started. Okay. So the ancient Indians were deeply invested in gaining perspectives about the material and the moral, the physical and the spiritual, the permanent and the temporary. So they had so many questions, and in finding the answers to that, they evolved. They brought out the rules of grammar, logic, science, and all those discoveries that we know today came from that. Okay, so there was a deep sense of sacredness around the whole concept of learning and teaching. That's why when children, both boys and girls, reached a certain age, there would be a sacred ceremony where they would learn to read and write for the first time. So that ceremony still survives as Vidyarambha in southern India today. And in Bengal, it's called Hati Khori. So this shows that, there's a sacred ceremony where children are initiated into reading and writing. That shows how important education is for India. And then there used to be something called the Upanayana, which you might know, where when students embarked on higher education, that was another sacred ceremony where they would make a lot of oaths. They would promise, to learn, to be celibate, because being brahmachari was very important. When you're studying, you should not be diverted by other things. So you have to focus single-mindedly on education. So then there was a period when when students focused only on studying, learning from the guru. Okay, and then there was also a sacred ceremony associated with graduation when 12 years of study was completed, and sometimes they would finish earlier. And then there was a Samavartana, which was when you took leave of the guru, you gave guru dakshina, and you made certain promises to the guru to use the learning in a good way, not for the ill of mankind, and those kind of things. Okay, and so there was a mad rush for gaining an education from the Indian professors. So it was very interesting for me to know that the students came from all over the world, whichever part of the world was civilized at that time. They sent their best students to study in India. So like today, how students flock to America to study in Ivy League universities, or they try to go to Oxford and Cambridge, India was like that. And so the students came from all over the world. They came from Western Asia, China, Japan, Southeast Asia. And so it was also not, they undertook very arduous journeys to reach India. It was not easy, right? Today travel is so easy. But in those days, they had to walk, they had to come by ship, they had to climb mountains. And in spite of all those difficulties, so many students would land up in India. So if you read the accounts of Xuanzang, Fahian, the Chinese students who came here, you will see how many sacrifices they made in order to come and study in India. So that was it. Now, you stop me whenever you feel I'm talking too much, because I'm going to get carried away. So the earliest universities in India were forest universities, right in the lap of nature. So we hear of Rishi Kanva's ashrama, which was actually a collection of ashramas all close to each other. So it was like different departments of a university, and the student would go to one guru and gain knowledge in one subject, and after that that guru would send him to the next ashrama located near to that, and then similarly go to other gurus and complete what you would call a degree today after over some maybe 10 years, 12 years, 15 years. And this was presided over by Kanva. This is mentioned in Mahabharata. So this is what we could call that a university, a forest university. And then later on, we had the other kinds of universities, the brick and mortar universities. Then there were also temple universities, a whole variety of institutes which taught based on the need of the students. Then It's also interesting when you go back and see that there were no artificial barriers between religion and science, like you would see in the Christian world, right? They have tried to separate them. But that was not needed in India because religion itself would often lead to science because there was a lot of questioning, debating within religious practices itself in India. So, for example, in trying to draw the perfect squares and rectangles in order to do the Homa, they formulated the rules of geometry. And then when they wanted to find the perfect time to perform the homas, then in the process of doing that, they formulated the rules of the laws of planetary motion and celestial bodies. And similarly, grammar, pronunciation, it all came from religion because they wanted perfect pronunciation, they wanted rules of grammar. So there were no artificial barriers, and that's how so many of the what you would call the religious people were actually scientists. They were the ones like Bhaskaracharya, Brahmagupta, right? They all were very religious, and it was their religion which helped them to make all these scientific discoveries. What was your question? Did you have any specific question, or you?
So I guess based on what you said, I have one question that's at the front of my mind, which is, it seems from your description that learning in India was traditionally very interdisciplinary, where what you learn from one area naturally translates into knowledge and learning in another area. Right. And so are there some examples of the advantages and the in these complementarities?
In fact, it is spelled out. The interdisciplinary education has been spelled out by Sushruta himself in Sushruta Samhita. So that is the oldest text on medicine that we have available today. It talks about surgery, right? And Sushruta is often called the father of Ayurveda. But of course, he's in a long line of Ayurvedic scholars. So he doesn't say he's the father of Ayurveda. He cites many others. So he mentions, there is a shloka in Sushruta Samhita which says that a person who is only well versed in his own science would not have enough knowledge. You have to know other sciences in order to have a holistic knowledge. So that itself spells out the interdisciplinary approach to knowledge. So this was in medicine very clearly stated. So if you those who studied medicine would need to know so many other things. They would need to even know how to cook, because so many of the medicines that came from the kitchen, right? So they would also need to be good cooks. And so it was very interdisciplinary. I mean, if you see how the mathematics works are also are very poetic. So you can see that humanities and mathematics and sciences, they all go together. Imagine writing in 2 lines a shloka, which is both poetic and beautiful. At the same time, it conveys a mathematical concept. It was that interdisciplinary.
Wow.
Right.
So, yes, were you saying something?
Yeah, so I just thought I'll tell you about the spread of universities all over India. So in the north, you had Kashmir, and in Kashmir there was Sharda University. So today everybody has forgotten the name Sharda University, but it was called Sharda Desh, Kashmir, because of the Sharda Peeth, where so many people went to study, and it was very difficult again to get admission there, right? And it also had a wonderful library where people came from large distances to refer. For example, Ramanuja came from Tamil Nadu all the way. He went to Kashmir in order to refer to some manuscript before he wrote his Mahabhashya. He wanted the commentary of Brahma Sutras, which was only available in the Kashmir library attached to the university. And then if you went in the Bihar Bengal area, there was so many universities: Nalanda, Vikramshila, Somapura, Vikrampur, a whole lot of them, right? And we still have not excavated all those universities. So, in fact, in Bihar, when I went last year, they told me that there's a university called Telhara, which is being excavated. People still don't know about. In the west of India, there was Vallabhi University in Gujarat. That was also very well known. In central India, there was Ujjain, there was Dhar. And then if you go to the south, they're full of temples, and temples were universities too, many of them, especially the big temples, because they became a magnet for scholars and professors. And so many of the temples had annexes where you could hold lectures and debates. So temples, agraharas, and agraharas were where sometimes kings would give an endowment to many Brahmins to establish to live there near the temple. And so those colonies became places where students would go to the houses of the gurus to learn from them directly, and they would all have the houses next to each other. And so you could have debate. One could come out, and then they would all be together talking to each other, and it was just vibrant, a vibrant atmosphere of learning all over India. There was a premium on education, and people who were learned were highly, highly respected. So if you read Zhuangzang's account, he talks about how the love for knowledge is not forced. It is planted like seeds. The seeds of curiosity are planted in childhood itself. And nobody has to force anybody to study. They're just themselves so motivated. And he speaks about learned people who are not interested in any luxury, any pleasure. They lead very austere lives, and they keep traveling all over India, teaching students, having discussions, learning, expanding the body of knowledge. So it was very unselfish. Okay. And the other thing I want to talk about is the ecosystem of learning which existed, wherein the whole society was supporting those who were studying and those who were teaching, right? So, for example, in Nalanda, the Nalanda University was supported by the revenues of 100 villages around Nalanda, right? So the students who got admission there did not have to worry about food, drink, medicines. So the professors also, right? So all their needs were taken care of with the help of the revenues of 100 villages. And the culture was such that a student or a guru could just walk and knock at a door and say that, the concept of bhiksha. So bhiksha was not begging. Many people translate it into begging, but it was just that a student who is known to not have his own source of income, his or her source of income, can knock at any door and say that I want food, and the householders would give them food gladly, because they would respect them for giving up their life to learning. So that was the ecosystem of learning that I'm talking about. And also, the Brahmins were not supposed to amass wealth. So the typical Brahmin would be poor. So throughout the student days, they would not have wealth of their own, right? The society has to provide for them so that they are able to focus on their studies and their research. So they were poor. And whereas all the other varnas were allowed to have their wealth, to store their wealth, right? And so they gladly gave contributions to Brahmins. So whenever they performed any homa, they would give to Brahmins, because they knew that the Brahmins are not making money for themselves. So that's the ecosystem of learning, where everybody is supporting education, knowledge, learning, and that's the reason why you have so much of knowledge, so many texts in all various fields, right? Medicine, Shilpa Shastra, every field of knowledge that you can think of owes a lot to what the Brahmin scholars did in ancient India.
That's great. So one question that comes to mind is that a lot of the, support for universities was through public funding. Are there examples from ancient India of private funding of universities as well?
Private funding, as in maybe industrialists? Yes. I mean, that was the culture. So the taxes that were given to the government would be used for the Brahmin, for the scholars. And of course, when I mean Brahmins, it's not just Brahmins by birth. There were also many who took an interest in a subject and pursued it, and then they would be also initiated. Okay. So yeah, there was all kinds of funding. There was public funding. The villages giving helping the students, and the contributing to universities. Like when I went to Nalanda, there was a storeroom where the villagers used to bring rice and grains, all the food needed. They would put it in that room for the students. Okay, and kings, of course, used to give it too. There also was there were also debate tournaments, intellectual tournaments, where scholarships would be awarded to the students who spoke the best, who were the most logical, who were the most learned, and using the best language. So that scholarships were also given by the state. So more of public funding. Yes, but also, yes, it was considered a very, if you see the inscriptions in South India, you can see that there are examples of private funding where rich people have donated to this college for so many students to study. It's all there in the inscriptions, right? And there are that the inscriptions show how institutionalized education was, because they specify how much of allowance is to be given to the students. And for example, those studying the easier subjects would be given lower allowance. Those studying the higher Mimamsa, Vedanta would be given higher allowance. The teacher would be given 16 times the allowance of the student. All those things are mentioned in the inscriptions. So it was very institutionalized.
So one question that's coming in from our viewers, which is I guess based on something that you mentioned, this viewer is asking, is it true that people who are Shudras by profession were wealthier than Brahmins because Brahmins could not amass wealth?
Yes, there were plenty of very wealthy Shudras, Vaishyas, Kshatriyas. Of course, I'm not saying there were no wealthy Brahmins. I mean, it's not like everybody is strictly following the rule. There might have been some corrupt among them, but they were not respected. So if there is a teacher, Brahmin teacher who is very rich, he's not going to be given the same respect as someone who is following all the austerities, because austerities were very hard. You know, the Brahmins have to be very clean. They have to wake up early morning, have bath 5 times a day and all that. I mean, there's so many, I don't know if it was all being followed, but that is what was prescribed for the Brahmins. There were more prescriptions for what Brahmins have to do than for all the other Varnas. The other Varnas were freer. And also, you know, the artisans, many of the artisans were Shudras. If you read the Arthashastra, it talks about artisans, Shudras being artisans. So then, you know, all these different artisans producing various products that were all exported, that were so valuable throughout the world, were coming from Shudras, right? So they were keeping their money. So it is not what it is portrayed in mainstream history, you know, where it's like Shudras being oppressed and Brahmins reigning over them. It was not that. Brahmins also had a very tough life.
So another question coming in from another viewer. So this is about foreign funding of Indian universities. So the question is, while visiting Thailand and Cambodia and the museums there, people often read that the princes from Thailand and Cambodia would go to universities in India like Nalanda to get education, and their fathers, the kings, the monarchs of these kingdoms in Southeast Asia, would then fund Indian universities. Could you speak about that relationship between Southeast Asia and India and the educational link there?
So what I know is that Yijing has mentioned that he didn't go to India directly to study. He first went to Indonesia, and there he had a kind of like a course. He studied there, and he probably learned Sanskrit. So it's also a thing that not everybody went directly to India, because it was very hard to compete with the students of India, right? So many of them would go to the satellite countries, like so in Indonesia, for example, gain some learning there, and then go to India to compete. So it's not surprising at all that there were rulers from Southeast Asia, because they held India in such high regard, right? And it was considered a very noble activity to give to a university, which is training students, which is teaching them so many subjects, making them knowledgeable. So yes, that was quite common. Yeah, and I just also want, I don't know if I mentioned about debating, right? So debating was so intrinsic to Indian education, and so, you know, if you go and see, there is this famous debate between Adi Shankara and Mandana Mishra, right, which went on for days, and you can see that the judge is a lady. She's herself a learned scholar, and she's the judge. So that puts to rest all those insinuations that women were not allowed to study, they were not educated, and all that. Okay, so debating was very important, and when you went to debate somebody, you had to be very thorough with that other person's point of view. You should have read all that he has written, or you should have heard it. You should know, be well versed in the opponent's point of view before you took him or her on in a debate. Okay, and there are so many texts which talk about Tarka Vidya, Vada Vidya, right? And all so many of the ancient Mahabharata, Chandogya Upanishad, they all mention this, the culture of debate. And that's why we had this free questioning us, and then that led to reasoning, logic. right? The Nyaya Shastra is full of logic. It talks about, what is good reasoning and bad reasoning, right? So it tells you not to make wrong assumptions. So this would be a wrong assumption. So it's amazing how much importance was given to debating, to logic.
Right. So another question coming in from a viewer. So at the beginning, Sahana, you mentioned that the Chinese and scholars from other countries would visit India. So at the peak of the university ecosystem, how common was it for scholars from other countries to actually come and visit India? And what were the countries that Indians transmitted the most knowledge to? And where do we see the remnants of that Indian ecosystem of knowledge in these countries?
So I have seen that. I think with China there was very intense interaction in the beginning, right? The earliest, actually, it's very hard to say even China, because we're still discovering things. There was, even in ancient times, there seems to have been a connection with Greeks as well, right? We have also interacted a lot with Greeks. But yes, if you want to know about China, then we have records from I think the early first century CE, or maybe the first centuries BCE. From then on, you can see there is intense interaction between India and China. And mostly in mainstream history, you would read about the Chinese coming to study in India, but there is also a lot of there are records which talk about Indian scholars being invited to China and to translate the texts into Chinese. So hundreds of Indian scholars have traveled to China, and they used to be treated as special guests by the Chinese kings. And then they would, and so in China, it was considered a very sacred activity to translate an Indian text into Chinese. So, and most of these were Buddhist texts actually, but then Buddhism, not just philosophy, but also science, right? Science, maths, mathematics, everything. All this came in in the category of sacred literature. So there was a competition between these Chinese scholars who came to India. So who could carry the maximum number of manuscripts, or who could copy the maximum number of manuscripts and take them to China. Okay, so we have even evidence of scholars from Kanchipuram traveling to China, settling down there, and even their names used to get changed. Once many of these Indian scholars went to China, their names would be changed. They would have Chinese names. So today, when you read their works, you would probably not know that they were from India. Okay, so there was a big influx of Chinese scholars into India, and also Indian scholars going to China. And then when it comes, you talk about other parts of the world. Well, the Islamic scholars, early Islamic scholars, took a lot of knowledge from India. So even when Mahmud Ghazni invaded India, there was Al-Biruni with him. Al-Biruni came, and he was not following Mahmud everywhere. He was interacting with the scholars in India. He learned Sanskrit, and he was trying to get as much knowledge from them as possible in astronomy, mathematics, right? So, and that's how the Muslim scholars translated many of the Sanskrit books into Arabic and Persian. And then from there, it went to Europe. It was translated into Latin. So my colleague Raj Vedam has done a lot of work in this area. So if you read his papers, and in my book also, my book on the educational heritage of India, I have taken from Raj's work. So from the Muslim scholars, the Indian knowledge was transmitted to Europe. And then credit was not given to India. The Arabic scholars, many of them gave credit to India, right? You have all these Al-Kindi, Al-Farghani, Al-Khwarizmi. Some of them did give credit to India. But then when it was translated into Latin, they did not even give credit to the Muslim scholars. So if you see, the European Renaissance is completely it is the translation of the Arabic and Persian texts into Latin, and most of those texts came from India. And Southeast Asia, yes, if you see in Southeast Asia also, in those days there were many Hindu kingdoms all over Southeast Asia, so they were familiar with Indian languages, and so they would so the manuscripts were brought and they were taught, and Indonesia itself is named after India, right? So it was all attributed to India. Whatever knowledge that they pursued, they would look towards India for the correct interpretation, the correct understanding. So if you see in China, there's an instance of a debate between us in China or in Tibet. There were two people who were having a debate in front of the king. And in order to have the final decision, they invited some scholars from India to give the final decision on who is right. The king invited the Indian scholar. So it was like that. Indian scholars had the final word.
Right. So one question that comes to mind when you were talking especially about the tradition of debating within Indian culture, and you know this because you're very active on social media, is that the debating culture in India has really collapsed and the standard has gone down. So I'm wondering from you how this, I mean, more broadly than just debating, but how this educational system degenerated over time, and how you think it can be reinvigorated for modern times.
Well, specifically, how did the debating culture degenerate? Well, then the educational system itself degenerated, right? When the universities were destroyed, Nalanda was destroyed, Vikramshila was destroyed. When Bakhtiyar Khilji came and destroyed so many universities in one go, a whole body of knowledge was gone. The professors were killed. I mean, imagine today if some gunmen go to MIT or Stanford and just kill all the professors, kill all the students, and just a handful of them managed to escape somewhere. That's what happened to India during the Muslim times, right? So there was enormous persecution of scholars, right? So the Nalanda library was burned, and then Qutbuddin Aibak went and destroyed so many temples in Banaras. Banaras was full of scholars, right? So many of them fled with whatever manuscripts they could carry, and their families that fled to southern India. So scholars who managed to survive went to the periphery of the Muslim ruled regions, and then they tried to again generate new institutions, right? And some of them did survive. But then after that came colonization. When the Europeans came and colonized India, I think that was even worse, because they were able to convince us to loathe our own systems, our own education, and to think that the European science and European languages, they represented modernity, whereas anything Indian, anything ancient was old and regressive. So the Europeans were able to do that when they made, when the British especially, and it was a very well thought out strategy, right? The Macaulay system, which ensured that the Indian languages were replaced with English. And so once you start, and so when you take, they also, Macaulay wrote a letter to, I think somebody, his family, his father, I think, saying that once they start adopting English, they're also going to become Christian. And so they are going to lose respect for their own traditions, right? So that is how, this monotheism and, all this, so the diversity, I think to some extent got reduced when we shifted to one language, and, we started looking to the West for all knowledge, right? So I think now you talk about how to reinvigorate it. I think the more we learn about our past, I think the more it's going to invigorate us anyway. You're also going to understand that there were so many different philosophies which all coexisted. Nobody was at the throat of the other. I mean, they were arguing very fiercely, debating fiercely, but they're not killing each other over different points of view, right? So I think we should try to introduce the older styles, older content, educate which we can borrow from our ancient systems. And we could look at their debating systems too. For example, there are a whole lot of books on debating, on what qualifies as a good way of debating and what is not good. All those things can actually be used even today. Yeah, so I think we have to reset. We have to now get rid of all those the toxic atmosphere, and we have to actually have that culture of mutual respect, and then all that will come back. That whole thing that we have lost. Right, and we have to have a healthy respect, a healthy sense of identity, and we need to know our history. I think that is really going to help us to become more confident and be better versions of ourselves.
Okay, so knowing your history is the first step.
And one of the things for that is to know your language.
Yes, we're talking about
that is going to unlock it for you. That is going to unlock the history for you. So if you are a Hindi speaking person, please try to read books in Hindi, converse in Hindi, and then when you read the translations of Sanskrit texts in Hindi, it will make a lot of sense to you. Because, for example, Panchatantra. If you read Panchatantra in English, you just get a very shallow view of the whole text. But so I'm reading the Hindi the Panchatantra, and it's just so vibrant. The meanings are very different, and I'm getting 3 times the depth of what I got from the English Panchatantra. So not just Hindi, if you can learn Kannada, Gujarati, whatever is your mother tongue, I think that is one of the first steps to decolonize yourself and become a deeper person.
Do you think this, so that what you said I definitely think is very valuable. Do you also think that learning just your own mother tongue is an important skill for people living in India? I find that people in India can sometimes not be the best communicators because they're not experts at any one language.
Yes, that is true. That is true. So yes, absolutely. If you, it's like empowering yourself when you learn your mother tongue, because then when you understand your everything better, everything makes more sense, right? So I think yes, if you learn your language, then you probably don't even need to learn Sanskrit, because most of the Sanskrit texts have been translated into Indian languages. So it becomes easier for you to understand it in your own language. And yes, you definitely speak better, because many of us, we don't know whether we are thinking in Hindi or English, it's all mixed up out there, right? So I think it's important to learn ideally you should learn only your mother tongue for the first 8 or 9 years, 10 years of your life, and then go on to, that's the way even my father, my mother, they studied that way, right? And so they are in fact more articulate.
Right. So a couple of questions coming in from viewers. So one is about the degeneration of the system. So this viewer is asking, is it true that only 2 to 3% of the Vedas survive? How much knowledge have we actually lost due to conquest? And how much has yet still to be analyzed? How much existing knowledge is yet to be translated or looked at?
I don't think we can give a definite number to that. I mean, we know that a lot of knowledge is lost. And also, a lot of it was transmitted orally, right? And then some interpolations were also made. But so it's difficult to talk about how much knowledge was lost, but we know a lot of knowledge was lost. Even Ayurveda, for example. So the Ayurveda which is being practiced today is a very watered down version of Ayurveda, right? So many of those, the texts are very succinct, very short, very brief and pithy. And if you, so if, and so if you were, it was transmitted continuously without any breaks, then we would actually know the meanings of all those shlokas. So now there is a lot of guesswork going on what could they possibly mean, right? So the commentaries were very important. The ancient texts and then their commentaries, thousands and thousands of commentaries were there, and those have been lost to a great extent. Even Arthashastra was only revealed in the last century, right? It was lost. So we still don't know how many more shastras are there, right? And also new shastras ought to have been written. If we had a continuous civilization without any brutal invasions, maybe new smritis would have been written in keeping with the times.
Okay, one more, Akachi, a couple more questions coming in. So for people who are interested in learning the older styles of Indian education and implementing them, what is it that they should actually look for in a school? So how can these systems be implemented in a modern day setting?
So I think I went to this Virat Gurukul Sammelan earlier this year, and I saw that a lot of initiatives were being discussed. I don't know how far they've gone, but people are trying to revive the Gurukul style of education, where you actually live with the in a guru, in an ashrama with the gurus, right? And then and so you imbibe not just what is in the books, but you also imbibe other things, the values and the lifestyle. That was very important in the earlier days. This is lost now. Those values, right? So that they just don't learn what is in the books, but they also learn a whole lot of other things like respect for nature. So today, for example, we have a separate subject, environmental science and environmental engineering. But in the earlier days, it was every subject had nature in it. So whether you were studying chemistry, whether you were studying engineering, you would know that you have to take care of nature. You can't kill the fish in the river. You can't, produce so much smoke or produce fumes which would affect the living things, right? So all this was embedded in every subject. It was more holistic. So I think we need to do a lot of brainstorming. So how do we need to? I think those who are asking the question themselves should think about it, right? How can we do this? I think there are a number of newer institutions which are trying to do this. I know some, at least at the primary level, I know that they are trying to teach students, some in Bangalore. In fact, all over India, in Gurukul, there are small institutes which are doing good work, right? Which are trying to make the children think critically, not just spoon feeding them, and which are also making them develop memory. We used to mock the rote learning systems uh, that we had, but actually that was very helpful. Today, there is new research which is revealing that improving memory helps in many other ways. It makes you a better person because you're able to remember so much. You're able to marshal so many facts, and you become a better speaker. And you also remember, you're able to you become a more complete person when your memory is good. So if you just store everything in your devices and then don't remember anything, then you're actually pretty much not a very competent person. So that is something that also we can learn from the ancient education systems. How to improve memories, how to use your memory well, use different parts of your brain more effectively.
Okay,
Right?
so one question, I guess, which is a nice looking forward question, is are you hopeful for the future of India's educational system? Why or why not?
I am hopeful, definitely. I would never lose hope. I mean, this is a civilization which has survived for so long. Look at, go to Iran, where is the Persian civilization? Go to Egypt, where is the Egyptian civilization? But the Hindus have survived, right? And so I think it's all going to come back together. And you people give me hope. Uh, People like you, with the next generation Hindus, who are taking interest in all this. So I think there is hope. But more of us need to be in policy making. So we need to be in law, we need to be in various fields where we can apply the Indic approach, Indic perspective, because we should not be now looking, become specimens who are being examined by microscopes from the West. So we ourselves need to apply our own yardsticks, our own learning. The Triguna method of analyzing. All these things we have to adopt in our approach. So we have to develop our own paradigms. So again, start with your own language, read, get acquainted with your history, and then when you get into various fields, then the change will come. I'm very hopeful.
So definitely ending on a positive note. One question I wanted to ask you is, how can our HSC chapters get in touch with you and other members of IHAR to help bring this knowledge of our educational and Sanskrit, our heritage, our Sanskriti to the younger generation? How can we organize these types of one-on-one talks with more students?
Well, you can always get in touch with me by email. So my email is sahana.singh@gmail.com. So SAHANA.Singh@gmail.com. Or you can follow me on Facebook, Sahana Singh. Well, unfortunately, I've reached a 5,000 limit, but you can follow me or you can message me. I'm also not very active on Twitter, but yes, I can also be contacted via that. And I'll be happy to interact and share knowledge and also learn from you people.
That's really wonderful. So Sahanaji, thank you so much again for joining us today. Before we go, I wanted to again point out that you've written a book that goes through a lot of what we talked today in more detail. Would you just like to do a quick plug for your book?
Well, I'll show you my book again. So this book, The Educational Heritage of Ancient India, How an Ecosystem of Learning Was Laid to Waste, is available on Amazon. So if you Google if you put my name in Amazon, maybe you'll probably find this book. So you can order it online. And it's a very concise book, because I know that today there's an attention deficit world and we don't have so much of time. So it's just less than 100 pages. So it probably whets your appetite to read more on the subject. So I hope you will read the book and give me some feedback.
Definitely. And for those of you who are doing your last minute Cyber Monday shopping online, make sure to stop by on Amazon and purchase Sahanaji's book.
Right.
So Sahanaji, thank you so much again for joining us here today. We look forward to having many more conversations with you and with others from IHAR.
Thank you very much. It has been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Namaste.
Namaste.